for the average man, there was the option of selling your wife.
Really? Okay.
You could sell her. I mean, there's plenty of newspaper reports that tell you. I think was it Smithfield Market in London was almost a trading place for taking your wife, and you could sell her. One of the blogs that I wrote a while ago was I think that was in Kent, and that was a chap who sold his wife for a pint of beer.
Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related.
I'm really excited today to be joined by Sarah Murden from All Things Georgian. Sarah is an expert in everything Georgian, so I'm really excited to delve into this era. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This should be interesting, I think.
It would be. So, why the Georgians? Why do you love the Georgian period?
Oh, goodness. Do you know, I was sort of thinking about this because somebody else asked me why that period. And, you know, there's so many people do a lot earlier, and some people are into the sort of war periods and things. And, you know, I think the interest came about from being a teenager. I lived in Nottinghamshire at the time, and on the school bus going home, you sort of go down this fairly sort of steep. Well, my recollection now is it was a fairly steep hill. You'd go down the hill, and in the dip, the mist would gather, you know, during the winter and things like that. And some of the kids used to say, "Oh, do you know what? There's a grave there, and there's a ghost that walks." so you sort of, you know, you kind of like a bit freaked out by it. And anyway, I went home and I told my mum, started looking into what this was all about, and it turned out that not necessarily there was a ghost there, but there was a girl murdered there, who would have been sort of a little bit older than I was at the time, and her gravestone was still. I walked down to actually have a look. Her gravestone was there. That was 1817.
Oh wow! And that story had carried on all that time. You know, developed into a ghost story. But yeah,
it interested me. Plus the fact that I lived like sort of 5-minute walk from Newstead Abbey, where Lord Byron lived.
Oh, okay,
so all the scandal of Byron. So it was kind of like, you know, sort of, it was a place that I lived that had 18th century connections. So that was really how it sort of began. So quite a long time, well, a very long time ago.
And when we say the Georgian period, when is that? When's the sort of rough beginning and end?
Well, we cover, Joe, who has been the co-host of All Things Georgian, we start at the beginning of George the First's reign, and we finish 1830 at the end of, or roughly 1830. We finish with the end of George the Fourth, but sometimes it'll sneak slightly over into William. So I think everybody's got different sort of different definitions. Some will take it back to sort of Queen Anne, right the way through to King William. There doesn't seem to be, I mean, for me, Georgian equals the Georges, therefore 1 to 4. But I think it's quite loosely attributed, really.
Okay, great. And so what was life like for the average Georgian? I know you had these really different you know, I think anyone who's watched something like Bridgerton can see, or read any Jane Austen can see you had this real difference between classes.
Absolutely.
Could you explain a little bit about that? Why did you have this kind of wealthy class and poor class, and maybe not quite so much in the middle?
Yeah, I think that sort of that predates the Georgians. That goes back way back in time. But certainly for the Georgian period, there was very much an us and them culture, if you like. Where there were wealthy landowners. I mean, where I live out here in Lincoln, sort of in the middle of nowhere in Lincolnshire, it wasn't until about the early 1900s that the village itself, or people within the village itself, actually were able to buy the land. Until then, it had been owned by one lord for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there was that situation where it was about ownership of land and property, and with that and wealth and inherited wealth. So it was really difficult to, if you like, to sort of socially climb at that time. You were born into wealth, and that wealth was kept within your family and passed around through the generations, through the children. You're born into poverty. There weren't the opportunities to actually lift yourself out of that to any great extent.
So hence the need to keep money within families and to marry well, etc. So what if you were poor in Georgian times and you fell on hard times, what would happen to you? What help could you get, if any? What would you do?
I suppose the easiest answer to that is workhouse.
Right.
You would go and knock on the door of the workhouse, and that you had really pretty much hit rock bottom if you were needing to resort to that. There was parish relief as well, but again that was limited. So it was really, really difficult. And you've got to bear in mind that, I mean, people didn't, the life expectancy was relatively short. I mean, you did get people that lived, I think recently I've written a blog about a lady who lived to be 92, I think she was, you know, in that period. So people could live a long life, but the norm was sort of, if you were lucky, 40, maybe 50 was considered old.
Wow.
Down to the lifestyle that you led. The poverty would mean that you couldn't buy the food that would give you the sustenance that you needed. You'd be reliant upon whatever you could make. So perhaps bread, if you could get the flour. But the cost of wheat at certain times was incredibly prohibitive. So people couldn't necessarily afford to bake bread. And that left you with things like poaching, whatever you could get from the land or from the rivers. So it was a pretty tough time. Families, to have a family of 5 would be an average family. 10 wasn't uncommon. Infant mortality was incredibly high because obviously, you know, if the woman wasn't well nourished and you know, and she was pregnant, then the survival rate for the children was obviously going to be pretty low.
I'm sure I was listening to a podcast that was saying that the Georgian era had one of the worst mortality rates in history. You know, that it was really, yeah, which is quite shocking, really, when you think of all the lack of medical skills that came before and how we're beginning to develop those skills around that period.
I think the medical skills were being developed sort of towards the end, towards the latter part of the period. But yes, I mean, if you look at things like burial registers, it's quite shocking. I mean, I've been recently doing some research into my own village, and went up to the churchyard and saw a gravestone for a child of 6, I think she was. And then as you read down the gravestone, there's another one aged 4 and another one aged 2. Came back home, looked at the burials, and that particular 3-month period, there was something like 37 burials, of which 28 were children under 5.
Blimey. Do you think something like scarlet fever went round, or
I think so,
some sort of epidemic?
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I found some burial records recently where very handily the vicar had written in the cause of death for every single.
Oh, brilliant!
And I was like, wow, great find. But it was this adult died of scarlet fever, and then when I looked in the papers, you could see all these notes about other people dying of the same thing. So it was obviously the epidemic going around at the time. Yeah, it's really hard to imagine that kind of loss, isn't it? And I quite often wonder how they carried on, how they picked themselves up. And I don't doubt, I know there has been some kind of school of thought whether they didn't feel the grief in the same way as we do now. And I tend to wonder whether they did, but they had more people to talk to that were in a similar situation. So if you'd lost a child, chances are your neighbour had also lost a child, and so there was that more of a communal understanding. Whereas I think you know, and this is literally just my own thoughts, no historical evidence whatsoever, but you know, whether nowadays, because it's more unusual to lose a child, it's then more isolating and more lonely because there's less people to share that emotion with. Maybe, I don't know.
I suspect you're probably right with that. They were closer knit communities for sure. And you know, you weren't the first to lose a child, you weren't going to be the last to lose a child. You'd got females around you, mother, grandmother, aunts. You'd got the support network. Whereas we look at today, and you know, maybe your mother's at the other end of the country, or you know, your aunt lives abroad. You don't have them. Not in all instances, obviously, but in a lot of cases, we're in far-flung places, and so you haven't got somebody. You know, we can talk on Zoom. It's not the same as somebody putting their arm around you, letting you cry, and saying, you know, it'll be okay, blah blah.
Yeah, no,
I don't think
agree.
we don't have that sort of network today, really, not in the same way that I think they did then. As you said, I think death was around them a lot more than it is today. So there was an element of it became a fact of life.
Yeah, part of life. So talking about women, actually, what kind of activities other than having children might women have been involved in? What I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about women's rights, really, and why perhaps they were quite so obsessed about having a good marriage.
Well, a good marriage equals financial security. You know, we talk about today about marrying for love, but there was that, of course, there was. You know, there were love matches, and but I think a lot of it, though, I think was around continuing to build the brand, the empire. So, you know, your father had a big estate. He would look for somebody of an equal standing with a big estate in the next county, for instance, and you could start to, you know, you'd merge the two, you'd marry the two off, and you'd merge the two sort of seats of wealth, if you like.
Yeah.
So it was very much in the upper echelons. It was about marrying for money, and you just had to kind of hope that along with that came love, or at least a contentment. I mean, for a lot it didn't. You know, if you look at somebody like Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, that was the marriage of two wealthy families, and I think she had a hell of a life, not in a good way.
So who for those who might not know her, who was she and what happened to her? What's her story?
She married I'll probably end up getting it wrong. She married the 5th Duke of Devonshire. She was a Spencer before. And basically I don't think he was that keen on the marriage, but I think it was sort of his or his advisors basically said, you know, marry this girl, she'll produce you the heir and the spare that you need, two wealthy estates. But he basically treated her pretty much like dirt, as a commodity. I think he was more interested in his houses, his shooting, his dogs. All she said to do was basically she was a breeding mare for him. But he took on a mistress, and basically there were 3 of them living in that marriage, and basically she could either put up or shut up.
Yeah, I'm guessing you didn't you didn't have divorce, or if you did, you had to prove extreme cruelty.
Yeah, divorce was, I mean, I think, as I understand it, she's not somebody I've researched that closely, but I think she would have wanted a divorce, but with a divorce comes no money.
Right.
And no money largely leaves you one course of action, and that's to become a courtesan and reliant upon men to provide for you. So yeah, divorce was an option for the affluent, but it wasn't a divorce. A divorce wasn't possible for your average person. But what men would do for the average man, there was the option of selling your wife.
Really? Okay.
you could sell her. I mean, there's plenty of newspaper reports that tell you. I think was it Smithfield Market in London was almost a trading place for taking a wife, and you could sell
Blimey.
her. One of the blogs that I wrote a while ago was I think that was in Kent, and that was a chap who sold his wife for a pint of beer.
Oh
So
my gosh.
you can name your price really for the value that you placed upon her. So yeah, it's an interesting situation, because women, they didn't have anything really. You know, they were brought up to marry. That was what they were raised to marry and have children. So if the marriage didn't work out, then where did that leave them? That left them, you know, pretty much Hobson's choice, really.
Yeah, am I right in thinking women didn't have the right to own property during that period,
They
or
couldn't. They didn't own property unless they were. It's usually the interesting thing is when you look at wills.
okay,
Excuse me. Because if you look at, I've looked at quite a lot of wills recently, where the person who is leaving the legacy will actually leave it to a female, but it will stay on it for her use only, or for sole use only, exclusive of her husband.
okay,
So they were left land, they were left money. Whether or not they ever got to use it or to spend it might be a different matter entirely. But the will could actually stipulate that it was for her use only, which I thought was really good. I hadn't sort of really twigged that one particularly, that was an option.
yeah, I think that's really interesting too, because that's like it's a clear sign, isn't it, of trying to protect the women in your life, you know, to give them that financial freedom from their husband, and you know, just in case she needed it.
Yes. Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes you could be lulled into this sense that actually men didn't care about the women in their lives, and I don't necessarily think that's true. It's just that it was an incredibly patriarchal society. So, so
Yeah,
I'm
I
guessing you
think
had a
that's it. I think, you know,
responsibility.
when you read wills, you do actually see um, quite often that the husband will say, you know, to my dearly beloved wife. You know, so there obviously there was affection there, and you know, I mean, we're talking very generally about the whole period. There were awful things that happened to women at that time, and equally there were awful things that happened to men. But there were marriages that were marriages of love, for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah, and I suppose you get different types of love, don't you? Because I can imagine that you could slowly fall in love with somebody who, you know, in a kind of companionship love, at least, for somebody who kept you financially secure and treated you well, you know, and that you got on okay with. You know, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily you know, that kind of passionate, you know, love that everybody kind of, you know, it's not Wuthering Heights, you know, it's not kind of,
No, exactly.
it's not Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, but it is a comfortableness, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sure there was that. You know, and I think there's a lack of um, written information that has survived. Obviously, for people that were, if you like, working class, then chances are they couldn't read or write, and therefore there was no way of passing that information down to future generation. They didn't leave a will or anything, so we really don't know what life was like. For the aristocracy, we have a better idea because they leave letters and journals and wills, and they leave some documentary evidence that we can at least try to work out what their life was like. More for men. So we kind of know about the estate and who the estate was left to and how many horses they had and things like that. But the fascinating thing is when you read women's wills, where they've left a will, it is so much more informative. I'm leaving so and so my gold bracelet studded with diamonds, and I left this portrait painted by my painted for my great great uncle by, and it'd be a famous artist, things like that. I was reading one yesterday, and I've still got a lot of work to do on that. And that was somebody who had bequeathed 2 portraits by a famous artist. But I'm thinking, so I'm frantically Googling this artist. There's no sign of these paintings. So I don't know whether whoever inherited them, I don't know whether they didn't like them. Over time, they've just been destroyed, or whether they're tucked away in somebody's attic. So that would be really cool if they could ever be found.
Yeah, absolutely. It really would be. So if you weren't affluent, what, as a woman, were you able to work at all?
Yeah. I mean, women worked. They would work in the home and on the land anyway. That or doing whatever. I mean, suddenly around Nottinghamshire, they had framework knitters, and they would work from home. They would have the machine, or the machine, the frame, if you like, that they used to knit with. So they would be expected. They were on, if you like, piecework. So the more pieces you churned out, the more money you earned. So they would do that and keep house and raise the children. So that, I think, would have been, you'd have been pretty much working 24/7, or as much of that as you could. There were women who didn't marry and who ran their own businesses. There was a lady called Eleanor Code who ran a stone manufacturers in London. And she's pretty well known. We do know, a reasonable amount about her. But I'd love to have met her because I think she was quite feisty, and I'm doing this on my own terms. So yeah, there were women like that. So.
And was life more rural in the Georgian period? What kind of, have you got many big cities at this point, or are the majority of people still living fairly rural existences?
Still fairly rural at that time. It's not really until you sort of get towards the end of it, where you've got the industrialisation, that the cities actually start to really build up into what we kind of know them as today. When industry, where you're transporting things via the canal system, that towns, cities all start to develop in the way that we understand them.
Okay. And if I was your average Georgian bloke down the pub, what would I have been worrying about in terms of kind of politics and the country and my daily bread? You know how we'll sit down and we'll moan about, I'm a bit worried about us Brexit, and that kind of thing. I just wondered what kind of things were going on in the Georgian period that they might have been talking about.
I think your average man in the pub would largely be unaware of the wider politics of what was actually going on at that time. There were newspapers, of course, but your average bloke in the pub perhaps wouldn't be able to read, or perhaps wouldn't see them necessarily. But I mean, it was a time of change, and it was the start of the Industrial Revolution and sort of mechanisation of everything. So, if you were working the land, then you might be worried that your job's going to be taken over by machinery. And so that has an impact on your family, your standard of living. Do you go with the flow, or do you kick back and say, no, I'm staying, doing what I do? And then, you can end up losing your job and in the workhouse. It was fairly easy. I mean, there were wars obviously going on, but they were, a lot of it I don't necessarily impacted on your average person directly.
Okay, that's really interesting. I hadn't kind of realised that there was that distance from sort of countrywide events or political events and your average person.
Yeah, because I mean, your average person, as I say, wouldn't necessarily have access to the newspaper. There were newspapers, there were regional newspapers being published. It's hard to know, isn't it, really? But I don't, I don't think that they probably wouldn't have had time or inclination to read the newspapers. They might have read, there were these things called broadsheets, which would perhaps give them some information about what was happening in their local area. But as to what was going on in the wider country, unless it impacted on them, I think they were probably too busy living their lives. We sort of have the world as a much smaller entity now. We can chat via Zoom. For all I know, you could be at the other side of the world. It doesn't make any difference. We have the technology to chat. The only thing you would ever have known about Australia would probably have been the fact that we sent people there, we sent prisoners there at that time. So it wasn't somewhere you'd go on holiday, and it wasn't somewhere you'd live by choice.
Yeah, which is really interesting when you think about how colonial colonial we are. So so I guess you would be more like Joe in the farm next door has lost his job because they've got this new machine in, which is so is that the period where you have the Luddites smashing the okay.
Yes, so in the excuse me, the frameworks in Nottinghamshire were very much involved in that. So
okay. And so that's where they went in and smashed, just for clarity, it's where they went in and smashed all the machinery up so that they couldn't take their job, which is really interesting. I've got a gamekeeper ancestor. There's a whole Woodrow surname, and the whole line of them are all gamekeepers, master gamekeepers, and it passes down several generations, which is nice because it makes them quite easy to trace in the gamekeeper definition. If it's a Woodrow, I know it's mine. They're a gamekeeper, I know they're related to me somehow, sort of thing. So but they actually saw off a crowd of Luddites that had arrived at the farm. So they'd arrived on their master's land, and they stood in front of their master and helped stay them off. And I quite often wondered just how unpopular they were with the local population. I mean, the gamekeepers were not not popular at the best of times, and probably led quite isolated lives really from the rest of the community. And then they've gone and frightened off a load of Luddites who were potentially losing their jobs. So they're a good line.
Sometimes.
I've got poaching ancestors too, so it's a good mix.
Oh, that's a good mix, definitely.
Not on the same line necessarily, but so, and also you mentioned about the wars that were going on. That's throughout the entire Georgian period, wasn't it? That's the wars with France.
Yes.
Predominantly.
French Revolution.
So would being a soldier have been considered? Was there a tradition of somebody in your family? I'm just thinking of Jane Austen, actually, how you've always got kind of one of the siblings always goes off and joins the navy or the soldier, and I just wondered, whether that was actually an accurate. That's my assumption.
I think to a large extent it was. The heir, if you like, on a sort of more upper class, you would have the heir and the spare, and if you like, protected at all costs. And then any others, the church was a big one for them to go into. That was really popular. And then, as you say, the military.
Okay. I'm guessing with the church you've got the vicarage, haven't you? So it's quite, you've got a home attached to your job. And it's very respectable.
Some very lucrative vicarages to have, and there are others that you think, oh no, not that one.
I have a defrocked reverend in my family tree.
Oh, nice one.
And that is a Georgian ancestor, actually, thinking about it. So he I've talked about him before, and I've written about him. He got my ancestor, who was a servant, pregnant at the age of 16. He was 50 in 1841. He went over to France and had a pistol drawn duel So
I don't have
he
anybody
got in prison for
that's
fraud.
exciting in my family. That's
I really don't like him. He's not a nice guy. I don't think I personally think he's not particularly a very nice character. But yeah,
but all families have a black sheep somewhere, don't they?
they do. But yeah, that whole line, the Crespinets. I think his wife was a friend of Lord Byron's. So unfortunately,
there
I
you
am
go
no
then.
relation to her though. I'm through the illegitimate line, which is quite good. But yeah, but interestingly, they put this de Crespinay surname in as a middle name in the illegitimate children, and they passed it on as well several generations. So it was obviously quite important to them. Yeah, it's a really interesting case. He ended up.
Where's that come from then? That middle name.
So the middle name, the de Crespinay, is the surname of the father of the illegitimate child.
Right.
So his name was William Augustus de Crespinay, and she actually gives her son the name Augustus William or William Augustus de Crespinay, and then he passes that de Crespinay, all spelt in 101 different ways, down the generations. And I mean, my family, they were labourers, they were poor. This particular illegitimate son was brought up by his grandparents. I haven't quite figured out what happened to his mother Jane. But yeah, and the father's Heaton de Crespinay, old Heaton de Crespinay. His father was an Augustus. He ends up going to Australia, emigrating to Australia, and dies a penniless gold miner in in disgrace, really. So yeah, he's quite a character to trace. But that was that kind of, you would have been born in that Georgian period, and is obviously sort of one of the spares. And his his father's a baron, and his brother obviously older brother becomes a baron, and he goes into the clergy rather unsuccessfully. So yeah, it was so track.
Brilliant. I like it.
Yeah, it was a good one to research. It was interesting. So yeah, so they would so total sidetrack from what we were talking about there. Sorry. So so one going into the clergy and one becoming sort of a soldier or a navy, not particularly unusual. So have you got any favourite Georgians that you've discovered? Any people that you found yourself always telling other people about, or coming back to time and time again to look at?
Yeah, I think yes. I think that would have to be one of the books that we've written, which is that's the account of as a Georgian heroine, and that's Rachel Charlotte Williams Biggs.
Okay.
And it's a difficult. To be fair, the book's a difficult read at the beginning because she was abducted and assaulted. So it's a kind of like a trigger warning at the beginning, really. Or we probably should have actually put one in, because it doesn't make for easy reading. But she recounted her story of her life. She wrote it down in 1821, but it relates to her life in 1780 when all of this happened. And it was she wrote it as what she called a testament, i.e. an account of her abduction and everything. And not only she abducted once, but she's abducted by the same man who was completely obsessed with her a second time. She then manages to escape, and she reinvents herself. It's complete sort of transformation. And she is responsible for organising George III's Golden Jubilee. She goes off to France and she spies for the British, reporting back on what life was like in France at that time. And she just had an amazing life. But whilst we were writing it, there's this constant in the back of our minds, is this true? Did this really happen? You know, there were so many different things that happened that just made it seem like two completely different people. But I'd love to have been able to go back in time and meet her. I've got 1,000,001 questions that we didn't manage to answer about her life. We pieced so much of it together, from virtually just from this testament that she wrote, managed to work everything else out from that. So it was became a labour of love, almost eating, sleeping, breathing, talking to everybody else about her, phoning archives to ask for documents, and must tell you the story, and then tell you all about it, and explaining why we were trying to, what we were doing, what we were trying to find out, and so yeah. So yes, that would be her for sure.
I actually think that's a really important message that you just said there, that you phoned the archives and then you told them what you were, ended up telling them the story, because I think from a genealogy perspective, visiting the archives for the first time can be really, really nerve-wracking. And I think that's what you're saying there about you can actually have a phone call with somebody in a conversation and say, this is what I'm looking at, and I've read this guide and I think I need to go here, can you help steer me? Is perfectly acceptable. So I think that's actually a really important point.
She lived in Bristol, and that's kind of like the other side of the country for me. So it was kind of like not too far to travel, but it was sort of, there's no point in traveling that far if they don't actually have anything that might even be vaguely useful. So it was a case of making a phone call and then saying, this is who I'm researching, the person I spoke to so I said, I'm sure we've got stuff, drop me an email and let me know what it is you're actually, or what you think you're looking for. So I sort of ended up sort of padding out an email, and it was like, oh, actually, yeah, we've got this and we've got that, and then as you can build up a sort of rapport. And part of the story came across the fact that she said, she'd had a portrait painted by one of the most well-known artists in Bristol, and I didn't know any Bristol artists, so it was back onto the archives. Were there any artists? And it turned out, yes, it was a female artist, Rolinda Sharples, who had more than likely painted her. And we've never found a portrait of Rachel Charlotte anywhere, but we know she had one done. We know she was living in Bristol. Rolinda Sharples has quite a few miniatures and portraits of women that are unknown women. I would love to know if one of them was her, and I think one of them may well have been. It's about building up a relationship with the archives, because they are so super helpful. They really are.
When you mentioned the pictures there, it's almost like you want to trace all of her descendants and then kind of photo fit, see who has the most resemblance in your little miniatures to all these different descendants.
That was the problem. She had no descendants.
Oh no.
She never married. She used the name Mrs. as a sort of cloak of respectability. It allowed her to travel to France and not be questioned. She spoke fluent French, so nobody picked up on the fact, she's just this middle-aged, French-speaking, British married woman. So nobody questioned what she was doing. Well, all the time she's snooping. She even went into Napoleon's chateau and nicked some paper from there.
I love her.
and wrote letters to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and she kind of puts, P.S. She puts P.S. I pinched this from Napoleon's writing desk. What she was trying to get across, I think, really was, if you want me to be a spy, this tells you how good I am. Really? I can actually get in there and I can do this, and nobody questions. Would you question a middle-aged woman wandering around, looking at all the paintings, looking at all the buildings, talking to people in their own language? Would you even suspect that she was anything other than just a very cute middle-aged woman?
Yeah, excellent disguise.
So I think she was pretty. I have a real soft spot for her.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Talking about women, and which I know has kind of dominated our interview, hasn't it? But I know that you've also, which is how I found you, you'd written about Dido Bell,
yes.
and I just thought it would probably be negligent, really, not to mention the slave trade during the Georgian period. And I just wondered whether you could tell us a bit about Dido Bell and why she's important
Well, Dido
historically.
Bell, yeah, she was she has the sort of the label of being the first first Black British aristocrat. Her mother was a slave, and she was captured. Or we think she was captured by Sir John Lindsay, who was a naval gentleman. And it was his great uncle was Lord Mansfield, who was opposed the slave trade. There were a couple of very famous cases that Lord Mansfield was involved in, and he basically said that nobody living on British soil had the right to be or could be a slave. Dido was raised by Lord Mansfield and his wife at Kenwood House in London, just outside London, and we believe from everything we've read that she was raised as an aristocrat. There seem to be two schools of thought. There are schools of thought that say she was actually employed in the dairy, and she was not a social equal to her cousin who also lived there. But I've not found any evidence to support that sort of theory. And equally, the amount of money that the payments that were made to her cousin upon her marriage was more than Dido got. And birthday presents, things like that, her cousin got more than Dido got. So there is an inequality there. But I just don't know, really. We're still piecing bits together of Dido's life. She did have two siblings, and or half siblings, I should say. So John had 5 children altogether, all with different mothers.
Okay.
4 of them. Dido, we believe, was born in England. From a couple of documents that we've come across, but the other 4, one died in infancy, one either died in infancy or remained in Jamaica. We really don't know. We can't trace burial or anything for this child. And the other 2 were taken to Scotland and were raised there. The girl, Elizabeth, she married a chap who was a good friend of the poet Robert Burns.
Okay.
She gets mentioned in Burns's letters. And the boy, he went out to India, worked for the East India Company out there, and he died out there. But we know he had a daughter, but we don't know what became of her. But she was quite wealthy when he died, though.
Okay.
So yeah, so Dido married. I mean, there's been a film. There's a book by Paula Byrne about Dido, which is fabulous. If you don't know anything about her, haven't read about her, that's worth reading. Equally, there are probably about 10 or 12 articles now on all things Georgian about her. At some point, I will actually just I will probably take those all down and combine them all into one document, but that's jobs for the future. But Dido married, and she married a Frenchman, Jean de Vignier, who was a steward, and she lived till 1804, and she had 3 children, and until about 3 weeks ago, as far as everything seems to show, only 2 of them survived, but one of them, everywhere that we've looked, says died in infancy, but we know that he outlived his mother now. So that's kind of where I'm at with trying to find him.
Do you think it's fair to say that Dido was sort of exoticized at the time?
I think if you go by the painting of her, then yes, I think she was. Again, it's really hard to know. I mean, I think Dido, she would have largely lived in a very protected bubble, and I'm not quite sure what the painting's trying to actually reflect, whether it is sort of the exoticism of her colour. Is it painting her with Lady Elizabeth as a sharp contrast, the black versus white? And yet they're very, in the portrait, they're very close, and it seems obvious that the two girls grew up together, and from everything we've gathered, were very close. So how much Dido's skin colour actually had upon her and upon the family during her life, I don't know. Lord Mansfield thought the world of her. I'm not sure how much he actually saw her colour. I think he just loved her as a person.
It's really interesting. I guess one of the things that's interesting about it is that her life was not typical of somebody who'd, I'm surmising, not typical of somebody who'd been born to a mother in slavery and a aristocratic white man. I'm presuming.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. It wasn't typical. No, for sure. And I think, from that point of view, I think she had a good life, which I think is fantastic. But again, we can't go back. We can't actually go back there and see what the life was like. We know bits and pieces about it. In little snippets of information. For instance, she had a dentist come out to her. She'd obviously got toothache. She bathed in ass's milk from time to time, which must have meant she had presumably was a skin condition that warranted that. And Lord Mansfield paid for things like that. So you wouldn't do that unless she was part of the family.
Yeah, I think with so much of history, you have to read between the lines, don't you? You don't get the full answer. You have to make your own informed assumptions, I guess.
I think that's
it is. And I think you have to be upfront about the fact that that's what you're doing as well.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
I have to do that with my own ancestors at time. I can't find their voice. They were working class. They didn't leave any record, but I can read about what other people in the same positions were doing and what was going on in their area, and and you can kind of piece together what most likely
And I think that's it. I mean, it's fabulous when you can actually find tangible proof, whether that's a painting or a piece of jewellery or a will, or just something that you can actually, almost something you can touch, that you can say, well, this belonged to them, or they wrote this. But the vast majority of people, that sort of thing, just we don't have the luxury of that, and we don't know how they actually felt. Emotions, I think, are a lot harder to track down, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm always wary that I'm conscious that I know I do it, that I probably put my modern emotions onto the past because they're the only emotions I know. I don't know how else to feel any other way. So I'm conscious that I'm doing that, and I try to kind of either pull back from doing that or do that with a conscious, this is what I'm doing, because I don't have any other answers. And that's really difficult, I think.
It is difficult. I think somebody asked me a while ago, well, what do you think about Sir John Lindsay? And it's sort of like, everything I've read about him, I kind of liked him. And then, and you can kind of hear people kind of go, but he fathered 5 illegitimate children, and he left his daughter, at Kenwood House. And it's like, yeah, but he must have cared about her. He must have cared. He could have left her with her mother, wherever that may have been, taking her back to wherever she came from. But no, he didn't. He looked up. He made sure that Dido was provided for, that she was safe, that she was well educated. Dido's mother, he funded property for her in Pensacola, out in Florida. Okay. And she went off out there to live. Why Dido didn't go, we don't know. But it's so easy to put 21st century values onto what happened at that time, and that we have to be a little bit careful about actually doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree, because you've got to take, for example, his actions in light of the fact that we lived in a very patriarchal society, that we lived in a society where, thousands and millions of black people were slaves. So you've got to put it into the context of the time that it was written, not written, happened.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up, actually, I just wondered, talking about exploring history in that way, what tips would you give somebody who had perhaps researched their family history and found, managed to get back to their kind of Georgian ancestors, and not so much in terms of finding them actually in the records, but they wanted to get to know what their lives were most likely like? What tips would you give somebody who was looking to do that? Would you give any advice?
Right. I mean, well, a plug for all things Georgian, of course.
Absolutely.
And there's about 600 articles on there, so I think there's probably something there that will hopefully interest people. Newspapers are fabulous. Absolutely, you're smiling at that. Well, I'm sure you must do it.
They're my favourite.
I start reading a newspaper looking for something, and just off to the side there'll be something else, and it's like, oh, that looks interesting, and I completely forget what I was actually looking at, and I get fascinated by something completely different that I'd no intention of actually exploring at the time. The newspapers are a great source of information, because whilst it might not tell you about your ancestor, I mean, if say they were a framework knitter, and you'd like, oh, I don't know what a framework knitter does or anything or what happened, try searching in the newspapers and you'll find information about them. Archives obviously are are a fantastic resource. Other than that, books, Google Books, you can use those for free. There's the goodness, I don't know what it's called. Is it Haiti Trust?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I know I dip in and out of
I'll
there.
put a link. I know the one you mean. Yeah, and I can't think how it's spelt.
Yeah, there's the Internet Archive as well. That's always useful. So there's so many more resources coming online now that people can actually go further back. Wills are always they're one of my favourites. I love reading. I'm really sad. I love reading wills.
Oh, I think that, no, I agree. I think wills are really fascinating. I'm always sad that I have got couple in my entire family history, really, except for probably that one aristocratic line, which actually isn't a line that I've looked at very much because I don't feel very connected to it. So funnily enough, it's probably interests me the least out of all the lines that I've got. I just don't feel like they're mine somehow, which is odd, isn't it? It's not logical. I've got just as much DNA from them as I would have from any other line, but
you do find parts of your family that you are connected to and parts that you aren't, and parts that you wish you weren't. So it's a difficult one. It is difficult.
Oh, well, thank you so much for talking to me. I feel like I've learned an awful lot in a really short space of time, and I as a big newspaper advocate, I'm always talking about newspapers, and I feel like I must bore everyone stupid. So I'm getting tangled up as I'm saying goodbye. I must bore everybody stupid by repeatedly saying, please look at the newspapers, please look in the newspapers.
They are fabulous.
The fact that they're digitalized and you can search by keyword, it's just absolutely incredible. And you can search for anything. It doesn't have to be a no, I completely agree. So I could feel myself on that edge of that rant there. So I just pulled myself back a little bit. No, thank you ever so much for talking to me. I would encourage anyone to go look at your website. I think it's a brilliant resource. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.